On September 4th, 2025 at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the Nintendo eShop, PlayStation Store, Microsoft Store, and Steam all crashed. Not because there was some kind of global AWS outage or large-scale cyber attack, but for a much simpler reason. A video game released, specifically Hollow Knight Silksong, the DLC turned sequel to 2017's Hollow Knight. With no pre-order period and no physical release, players rushed to online stores the second the game became available, and did so in such high quantities that they bricked each and every one of those storefronts for a short period of time. A few weeks prior to this, one of the games industry's most prominent journalists, Jason Schreier, released an article about Silksong. And in that article, we got confirmation that the original Hollow Knight had sold roughly 15 million copies to date. Going off of publicly available figures, that makes it the 10th highest selling indie game of all time, and number 1 among games with absolutely no multiplayer elements, solidifying it as easily one of the most influential, celebrated, and successful indie games ever made. 10 years earlier, on November 19th, 2015, one of the first game's trailers was shared on Reddit by a friend of the team. While the response was generally positive, there was also a broad consensus that the game had a lot of competition in an overstuffed genre. One of the top comments reads, "I'm sure it's a fine game, but the market is currently saturated with side-scrolling platformers, so I feel his game may not do as good as he hopes." Trying to understand both the critical and commercial success of a game like Hollow Knight is kinda tough to do without descending into vague platitudes about its atmosphere, how tight it controls, how great the art is. It's such an obviously well-crafted game that the natural instinct is just to say, look how good it is in all these areas, of course it sold well. But I don't think that quite captures just how unique of a case Hollow Knight is as far as indie success stories go. Not only did it make an instant impact on launch, but it only grew in recognition over time, in almost a linear fashion, which is practically unheard of for a single-player experience. Looking at its numbers on Steam alone, we can see that in 2017, a year where it certainly got its flowers, its monthly players ranged between 1,000 to 6,000 a month. 3 years later, in 2020, each month ranged between 6,000 to 12,000, and another 3 years after that, 7 to 13. At no point did Hollow Knight lose momentum, even long after it had put out the last of its DLCs. In fact, per Schreier's article, about 80% of its total sales came after the team had moved on to Silksong. And in that same time frame, this game was effectively crowned as the de facto title in the de facto indie genre. So when I ask why Hollow Knight, it's not to question the game's quality or whether it deserves to have seen success, it's to try and figure out why this game specifically, and I think the first contributor to that has to be timing. The Metroidvania genre at the time of Hollow Knight's release was going through a bit of a modern renaissance, with the 2010s giving us games like Guacamelee 1 and 2, Axiom Verge, Environmental Station Alpha, Blasphemous, Bloodstained, The Messenger, Yoku's Island Express, and plenty more. Not to mention 2 Ori games that you could argue dwarf Hollow Knight when it comes to production value and fluid-type platforming. But despite the litany of games coming out over the decade, the genre's sudden boom had a lot more to do with its accessibility than it did any particular surge in creative inspiration. These games were relatively easy to make, didn't necessarily box out devs who weren't the best artists, and game engines like Unity were practically tailor-made for 2D side-scrollers. So even though this list I rattled off looks impressive at first, it's worth noting that most of these games actually released after Hollow Knight, and there were also dozens, or hell, hundreds of these games releasing every single year, with nearly all of them remaining in the shadow of Castlevania Symphony of the Night, a game from 1997. The formula produced by that game and Super Metroid was so rock solid and reproducible that practically everything that came after it was just a pale imitation for a really long time. And the fatigue from those commenters in 2015 most likely came from this fact. Here comes another game that's chasing the same dragon from 18 years ago. What the genre desperately needed was a new face, which really reframes the whole oversaturation conversation. You could argue, and I am, that the exact things that were seemingly working against Hollow Knight were the very things setting it up to be iconic. iconic. The majority of experiences were still following in either the dark gothic footsteps of one grandfather or the lonely space isolation of the other, with the few deviations going off in extreme directions. The world and art design of Hollow Knight, on the other hand, hits an almost impossible balance between over-adherence and complete dissociation. It remains dark and melancholic, but presents ideas rooted more in high fantasy, with fallen kingdoms, monarchs, and prophets, and then mixes that in with a playful, anthropomorphic coat of paint. It never stops taking itself seriously, but it also isn't afraid of showing off its more whimsical side, ultimately managing to maintain the emotional core of those old games, isolation, decay, mystery, but recontextualizing it with new imagery and tone. But even with that said, while it's clear in hindsight that the genre was waiting for a definitive modern rendition during its Renaissance period, Hollow Knight was not the only game that had a chance of being just that. I could just as easily be sitting here talking about how Ori and the Blind Forest managed to maintain that somber tone while setting a new bar for the quality of art and fluid movement. I could even talk about how insanely twisted Shadow Planet managed to stretch the limits of how the gameplay and puzzles could work without completely altering the core formula, but instead, I'm talking about the bug game, so why is that? Well, I think on top of some of the stuff that I just mentioned, part of the reason is that Hollow Knight looks achievable. Like I said, this genre is the king of accessibility, at least on the developer side of things, so for a game to become the modern template for Metroidvanias, it had to have a bit of an everyman quality to it. And Hollow Knight, while beautiful, is also very restrained and unassuming. It sticks to the fundamentals. It's really hard for a small development team to look at a game like Ori for inspiration because that's immediately operating at a visibly high technical level. Meanwhile, Hollow Knight feels like it is a bit more down to earth, and because of that, it became the lightning rod for games like Haiku the Robot, Nine Souls, and Crowsworn. But to be clear, looking achievable is not nearly the same thing as doing the bare minimum. Let's talk about layering. Oh, that's a weird way to pronounce Lost in Cult. I'm assuming that if you're watching this video, you're a fan of indie games, and like me, really enjoy it when those games get physical editions, art books, and other extra materials, which is why I'm always excited to partner with Lost in Cult, because they always put out incredibly high quality products for games of all sizes. From beautifully crafted design books for titles like Animal Well, Mouthwashing, and Alan Wake 2, to novels covering the development of Dead Space or the annotated works of Jacob Geller, to full-on board games like their newest campaign with World of Horror, a wickedly cool eldritch survival horror indie game. From now until April 30th, you can pick up one of the deluxe editions of the World of Horror board game, which come with fun extras like a lighthouse dice tower, the Book of Endings, 3 exclusive mysteries that were crafted with the help of acclaimed writers like Hifumi Kono, the creator of Clock Tower, and illustrated mystery end cards with different artists from the Japanese horror scene serving up their own interpretations of some of World of Horror's creatures. There are 3 variants for the deluxe edition. The Neo 80s colorway available through Lost in Cult, the Shrouded colorway which is available through the IGN store, and the Guro edition, which comes with hand-signed prints of the special illustrated cards. And there are only 300 of each variant available, so if you're interested, I recommend you grab them fast. You can also always opt to buy the standard edition if you want, and if you're watching this after April 30th, the standard edition will still be available for purchase. If anything from Lost in Cult looks like it's up your alley, even if it's from a different campaign, you can use the link in my description or use the code USAWOH at lostincult.co.uk to get 10% off site-wide. Thank you to Lost in Cult for sponsoring this video. Alright, back to the other thing. Layering is one of those things that I don't think has an exact formal definition in game design. I guess the closest neighbor would be depth, but I kind of use it as a broad strokes term for stacking information or content on top of each other rather than spreading it all out. This can be seen in overall map design, like how some of Elden Ring's most memorable moments come from discovering entire massive areas that are totally optional and hidden away from the base world map. It can be seen mechanically, like how Alan Wake 2 and Titanfall 2 often have 2 interwoven versions of the same level existing on top of each other, and it can be seen in storytelling, where an item, location, or character may remain unchanged, but takes on new significance once you understand more about the world. Like I said, it's a bit of a broad term, but the idea that there's always something below the surface is, in my opinion, the single best way of winning over genuine player trust. Not only is it antithetical to the ideas most players associate with cheap game design, namely artificial padding, but it also rewards curiosity. It's also the entire reason Metroidvanias work in the first place. Backtracking is not an inherently fun thing to do, it's only enjoyable because as your character grows, old areas take on new meaning. Layering is the heart and soul of this style of game, and Hollow Knight is the single best example of layering I've ever seen. This is something that becomes apparent within the first few minutes of the game. The first proper area you explore, the Forgotten Crossroads, has a stunning level of depth. Not only are you immediately hit with that classic side-scroll parallax effect with the multiple background layers adding seemingly infinite depth, but you also see these little creatures, which I assume are bellflies, streaking across the screen anywhere from the layer furthest back right up to the front of the screen, which makes this entire area feel lived in. You also see water dripping down from the ceiling, fog encasing everything around you, fine drifting particles all over the place, shells on platforms which are all different sizes and patterns, and then of course there's the foreground, a lot of which you can directly interact with. Striking your nail on signs and spikes chops them in half, while grass shoots straight upwards and falls softly back down, which contrasts with the grass that you just saw above ground, which, due to the gusts outside, got whisked away into the wind. If you walk through an area that features golems, you'll notice that dozens of them are being littered throughout the background as well. Acidic water bubbles and steams. Nothing ever just does one thing. The game is very simple and straightforward when looking at the surface, but it's constantly serving the player a metric assload of detailed effects at all times. This is also true for the combat. At no point does the game become all that mechanically complex at its core. Outside a handful of spells, you spend most of the game jumping, dashing, and swinging in 4 directions. But there's so many small things at work here that make the combat always feel satisfying. Enemies violently react to every single hit, and each swing produces smoke, sparks, and shockwaves. I mean, look at this impact animation. You have your regular swing effect, and then this anime sword swing trail shooting all the way behind you, and then another trail that shoots off tangential to the point of impact like a massive spark, as the sheer weight of your attack creates enough of a shockwave to completely obscure your enemy behind it. This is a pretty intense effect for what's effectively Hollow Knight's version of stomping a Goomba. Even healing has all these extra details, from the slow swirling liquid drain effect on your soul meter to the tight shake and micro zoom onto your character. There are just so many small decisions here that aren't always obvious until you really start paying attention. If you're curious about hearing more of these details, by the way, I'd recommend this video by Juniper Dev. She does a really great job laying out how well the game uses color, sound effects, and responsive feedback to elevate its game feel, and goes a bit more in depth on some of the things that I brushed over quickly here. Then there's the layering and the storytelling. Hollow Knight almost never directly tells you what's happening. Characters speak vaguely, locations are presented without context, and major events are implied rather than shown. Early on in the game, NPCs and inscriptions on cave walls will make mention of some kind of fallen kingdom, infection, a king, but none of it makes any sense until you actually start piecing things together yourself. Something that is also, crucially, very easy not to do. You can absolutely play this game with your brain off, and it'll still work perfectly fine as an exploration and combat experience, but if you want to pay attention, all the small details will begin to accumulate. Areas will stop feeling like set dressing and start feeling like places that had a purpose. Enemies will stop reading as obstacles and start reading as victims. And your own place in the world also begins to change shape the deeper you go. And of course, you can't ignore the layering in the map itself. Each biome of Hollow Knight feels like its own isolated world, especially given how drastically different the color palettes are and how sharp the transition is between them. While a lot of the key areas do sport slight variations on this main muted blue color, there are plenty with completely different identities. City of Tears is this brighter cerulean blue, Fungal Waste has these sickly spores, the Hive is honeycomb yellow, while its neighbor, the Ancient Basin, is completely monochrome. Fog Canyon has a purple mist, while Crystal Peak's purple is sharp and dominant. Kingdom's Edge is a hollowed silver, and Green Path is green. In every conceivable sense of the phrase, Hollow Knight gets more rewarding and more interesting the deeper you go. It doesn't just treat the Metroidvania playbook as a formula, it truly understands what a Metroidvania should be and builds its entire identity off it. Everywhere you look, every character you meet, every platform you walk over, every enemy you face, there is always something under the surface. And in most cases, this is kinda where we'd wind down. We've established the game's merits, and the fact that it arguably released at the perfect time despite worries of oversaturation, so of course it gained an incredible reputation and quickly became a fan favorite in the Metroidvania community. Hollow Knight launched well, and it's no wonder why. But we also can't really stop here, because Hollow Knight kept doing well. Hollow Knight had a fairly strong initial response for an indie game funded off of Kickstarter. It scored an 86 on Metacritic close to release and sold a total of 65,000 units within its first month, a number that Team Cherry seemed pretty happy with, but one that pales in comparison to the heights the game would eventually reach. Over the course of the next year and a half, the team would put out 4 free DLC packs, including the Grim Troop DLC, which added arguably the game's most recognizable boss, as well as a fun short side story to unravel, and the Godmaster DLC, which presented fans with the ultimate challenge, a full boss rush mode that had you fighting every single boss in the game back to back, and then ended with this bullshit. A couple months before that final DLC, Team Cherry had reported to Kotaku in a now deleted article that the game had sold 1 million copies. An incredible upswing from the already solid launch, but still, after 18 months and basically the entire post-launch cycle behind it, the game had barely hit a fraction of its eventual popularity. So to understand what kept Hollow Knight not just alive, but thriving post-release, I think we again need to touch a little bit on the state of games at the time. The late 2010s saw a pretty significant bump in interest for speedrunning, something that Hollow Knight was exceptionally well built for, considering it was easy to read and get a basic handle of, but also had really good movement depth, a few famous platforming challenges, and now the boss rush mode as well, all of which helped the game cultivate a thriving speedrunning and challenge community. It also launched around the time that the Souls genre was really beginning to pick up steam, but also before there were that many good options to choose from outside of From Software's own offerings. Not that I personally think that Hollow Knight is all that much like Dark Souls. In fact, a lot of the similarities are just from other Metroidvanias, but that didn't stop people from treating the game like a 2D Souls-like, with its loss of currency on death, resting checkpoint system, and boss-heavy hit-and-run combat. Multiple early reviews even directly liken the game to Dark Souls, so whether you agree with the classification or not, the alignment to a burgeoning juggernaut of a genre certainly didn't hurt its sales. But to be honest, a lot of that stuff is more supplementary. To really understand the obscene success of this outwardly unassuming game, we kinda have to talk about the Silksong of it all. Hollow Knight's Silksong originally stemmed from a Kickstarter stretch goal for the original game, described there not as a sequel, but simply as a second playable character with their own quests and abilities, so essentially, story DLC. Then, about 6 months after the Godmaster DLC, so roughly 2 years out from the vanilla game's release, Team Cherry gave an update. This initially add-on content had now been promoted to a full sequel. They even shared a reveal trailer for that sequel, and the wording of the update made it seem like the release was somewhat imminent. The next update after that, in June of the same year, doubled down on that sentiment with what the team described as a long past due Silksong update. This also came hot off the heels of a playable demo at E3, all signs that while the game may not get finished in the next few months, it would surely be at most a couple years away barring any serious issues. So naturally, the next Kickstarter update was 6 years later. Now, it's not like we heard nothing over that period of time, but also, we kinda heard nothing over that period of time. Outside of a whisper here and there, the only real, tangible piece of information came in 2022, when a trailer for the game was shown off during an Xbox showcase that claimed it was exclusively showing titles that would release in the next 12 months. This was obviously a lie, and it would be just shy of another 3 years before we'd receive an update from another Xbox showcase claiming that the game would be a launch title for that year's ROG Ally. A claim that meant literally nothing considering whatever the hell happened over here, but one that shockingly was in fact true, as the actual release date was announced in August of 2025, with the game releasing just a few weeks later. Now, the games industry is no stranger to insane development cycles, especially recently, but Silksong's cycle is unique even among that group for a few reasons. First off, there was way more concrete evidence of this game actually existing in a workable state than you usually get with your PNG reveals for Elder Scrolls 6 or cinematic trailers for Beyond Good and Evil 2. This game showed off a public demo just months after its announcement and then went almost entirely silent for over half a decade. I can't think of a ton of other titles that fit that bill. It was also a rare case of a beloved indie developer having announced what they were working on next immediately rather than leaving the fans guessing. Indies often attract the most die-hard fan bases, but a lot of the time there's not a lot for them to rally around after the game is released. For example, we still, as of this recording, have no idea what Studio MDHR is going to do next. Are they going to keep doing Cuphead, try something else? Are they even going to make another game? Who knows? We didn't know what the Celeste team was working on for a really long time, and as it turned out, neither did they. Silksong was definitely a unique case on this front. I mean, fans technically knew about it well before the original game released. And despite the information on it being so sparse for so long, every time the game did pop up, it gave the impression that it was just around the corner. Every single year, for like 5 years, felt like the year that the game had to come out, because there was just no way it was still further out than this. And the more that sentence proved to be false once again, the more it baffled fans, making it prime real estate for a sort of new form of popular online fan behavior that can only really be described as insanity. See, over the last decade, release schedules across entertainment have slowed dramatically. Movies take longer to make, TV seasons are shorter and further apart, and game development cycles have hit extreme highs. And in turn, we've seen a shift in how a lot of fan bases operate, as they slowly become more and more desperate to cling on to any new piece of information they can find in hopes that it's somehow alluding to an imminent release date for something. And I do understand that for the most part, this can all just be classified as random internet bullshit, but the fact of the matter is, we are, as a species, more online than we've ever been, which means sometimes random internet bullshit can actually affect things. Especially when we're talking about word-of-mouth marketing for a game that didn't have a physical release, and whose actual marketing team kinda didn't do anything during some of its biggest surges in popularity. Silksong came to be in the exact window where this culture was hitting new levels of popularity. Fans would construct elaborate arguments for why the game had to appear at an upcoming showcase, only for nothing to happen, and that disappointment became a running joke. And then the running joke would turn into more content, which led to more eyes, which led to more hope about something coming in the future, and more disappointment in an endless cycle. This is the same point in time where we saw entire YouTube channels become dedicated for daily news about a game that was radio silent, and Silksong was right in the middle of that trend. Reddit culture, a phrase that I hope I never have to say again, was also changing as a result of all of this, as fan communities without anything new to talk about slipped slowly into insanity, the best example obviously being the Batman Arkham subreddit. Silksong's community had followed suit, at one point pretending that the game had already released, as posts and comments alluded to entirely made-up lore and in-game moments, and then it started seeping a little bit more into the mainstream. Every game showcase would be littered with fans spamming, "Where's GTA? Where's Bloodborne? Where's Elden Ring?" And in the midst of it all, where's Silksong? One of these things is clearly not like the others, and that added even more fuel to the fire. What was this weird little bug game, and why was its community losing its mind? The mythos of Silksong reached heights that even its most dedicated fans couldn't have predicted back when it was first revealed. And I do believe a lot of that fervor, and in turn the rolling success of the original game, was the result of having a die-hard fan base that had both so much and so little to latch onto for 6 years, an effect exacerbated by the new trends in online discourse. And that's not to claim that Hollow Knight became popular just by sheer luck of the draw of when it came out and its silence in its marketing. I mean, you only get this kind of fan base in the first place by producing something people already resonate with, but it certainly didn't hurt that the sequel had arguably one of the greatest accidental grassroots marketing campaigns of all time. For all the flack that Team Cherry received for their silence during production, that may have counterintuitively boosted their success, whether they intended it to go that way or not. When Hollow Knight Silksong finally released, it sold over 7 million copies in its first 3 months. A truly staggering figure that already puts it at number 22 all-time in indie game sales, and number 4 among single-player only titles. Again, as far as official sales records go. With DLCs to come and a bump in original Hollow Knight sales happening around the launch of Silksong, it's not far-fetched to think that the lifetime sales of this duology will reach about 40 million over the next couple years. A truly ridiculous figure that likely would have sounded completely impossible to Team Cherry back in 2017. And it's a real testament to the importance of detailed, layered design work, the idea that creating something simple doesn't mean creating something basic, and the fact that if you trust your players will trust you. Even if it sometimes feels like maybe they shouldn't. There's still a lot of fair criticism to be made about the communication around Silksong's development, especially for backers who are financially invested, but it is also interesting to see the ultimately extremely positive impact of that decision. Hollow Knight's iconic status was cemented for the same reasons it was doubted, and the sequel's success was transcendent for the same reason fans thought it was shooting itself in the foot. Which I guess makes it a nice reminder that sometimes we really don't know what the hell we're talking about. A quick reminder that if you want to check out any items from the Lost in Cult store, including the new World of Horror board game, you can do so using the link in my description or using the code USAWOH at lostandcult.co.uk. If you want to see more of my stuff, I have a second channel where I post some shorter content when I can find the time, and I also have a podcast where my friend Landon and I talk about a bunch of fun game topics. One of the newest episodes has us ranking some of the recent indie games that we played, along with a friend of the channel, M8 Swoosher, who you might know from these videos. We talk a little bit more about Silksong in that podcast, and a few other games that we really liked, so go check it out if you're looking for recommendations. Subscribe here if you're new, join the Discord, it's in the description, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.